He expected to testify against the suspect. What he didn't expect was to see that same man seated beside the judge, wearing a suit flipping through a binder with his name on it. The courtroom wasn't about charges anymore. It was about patterns, and Dr. Ellis Rowan had come not to defend, but to expose. And the moment he clicked his pen and looked up, officers Keaton and Maddox realized they hadn't just cuffed the wrong man, they'd triggered a reckoning. It was just after 8:45 a.m. in downtown Eugene when the call crackled through the patrol car's radio. Suspicious person, black male 30s, dark blazer, possibly attempting vehicle entry near 5th and Monroe. Caller unsure. Proceed with caution. Officer Daryl Keaton, who'd been sipping lukewarm gas station coffee and watching a squirrel dart under a truck, glanced at his partner. "That's just around the corner," he muttered. Officer Riley Maddox nodded, already straightening in her seat. She was still early in her career. Sharp uniform, quick movements, eager. Daryl had been on the force nearly 2 decades. He wasn't a bad cop, he told himself. Just efficient. Didn't waste time asking questions when instincts already had the answers. That's what they trained you to do: act first, write it up later. They turned onto 5th Avenue past a bakery with bright floral awnings and wooden benches. The Bougainvillea Cafe. The air smelled like espresso and butter, and a line of customers wrapped halfway down the sidewalk. There, Daryl said, tilting his chin. A man stood alone outside the cafe, tapping something into his phone, with one hand a white paper bag from the cafe in the other. Black, mid-30s. Navy blazer. Close enough. "Let's go," Daryl said, cutting the engine. No lights, no sirens. Riley was already unbuckling. "Excuse me, sir," she called, stepping out before the tires stopped. "Hands where we can see them." The man, Dr. Ellis Rowan, looked up, confused but calm. "Is something wrong?" he asked. His tone was even, polite, not defensive, not scared. "You fit the description of a suspect in an attempted break-in." Riley said, her hand hovering near her belt. "Stay where you are." Ellis frowned. "I'm just waiting for a rideshare. I ordered it 2 minutes ago." "Do you have ID?" Daryl asked, now approaching. "Of course," Ellis said, starting to reach for his inside pocket. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Daryl barked. "Step away from the vehicle." "It's not my vehicle," Ellis replied. "I've been standing here." "You're resisting," Riley snapped. "No," Ellis said slowly. "I'm just confused." Daryl grabbed his arm and spun him around. "Enough," he said, loud enough for several heads in the cafe line to turn. Phones were coming out now. Recording. The cuffs clicked into place. Ellis didn't struggle. He didn't raise his voice. He just stared at the sidewalk like he'd seen this before. Like he was waiting for it to pass. "Another one of those startup types," Daryl muttered. "Bet he's got a fake resume and a story about his consulting firm." Riley laughed, checking her watch. "We'll clear it up at the station." They never asked his name. They never checked his bag, which had a croissant and a receipt with a timestamp. They didn't check his phone, which still had the rideshare app open with a location pin right at the cafe's front door. In the back seat of the cruiser, Ellis sat perfectly still. He didn't look at them. He didn't speak until they were halfway to the precinct. "I'd like to make a phone call," he said calmly. Daryl smirked. "You'll get it after booking." But something about the man's tone, measured, distant, utterly unbothered, made Riley glance into the rearview mirror. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't pleading. And that unnerved her more than shouting ever could. At the precinct, the desk sergeant raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious person?" he asked, eyeing the man in the sharp blazer. Daryl handed over the form, matched the call, loitering around a vehicle. Ellis stood silent beside them. "Name?" the sergeant asked. "Dr. Ellis Rowan," came the response. The sergeant froze slightly, then typed. His eyes scanned the screen. He paused. "Dr. Rowan, you're entitled to 1 phone call." Ellis nodded. "Thank you." He didn't fumble for contacts, didn't scroll, just dialed. "Rowan here. I was detained outside Bougainvillea Cafe. Need records and notice sent to the State Inspector General's office by this afternoon." That was it. No yelling, no demands. 30 seconds tops. Then he hung up and waited. 2 hours later, a call came in, not to the front desk, but directly to the precinct chief. A directive from the Office of Civil Oversight: immediate release of detainee Dr. Ellis Rowan. All booking documentation to be submitted for review within 24 hours. Attached a state clearance badge, his title Deputy Director of Civil Oversight for the state of Oregon, and an advisory note. Darrell was in the break room when he saw Ellis again. Not in cuffs, not behind glass. Walking calmly down the corridor flanked by two people in suits. "Wait," he whispered, nearly spilling his coffee. "Is that's him," Riley said beside him. She stood up straighter. "He's not supposed to be," but Ellis didn't look at them. Not once. He just passed through like he already knew how this story would play out. And maybe he did. That night, Darrell had dinner with his brother and ranted about overreach. "Guy probably pulled strings," he muttered. "Whole thing reeks of politics." Riley sat on her porch, stared out at the trees, and told her girlfriend it was probably just a paperwork fluke. But 2 days later, rumors were moving faster than gossip ever could. Ellis Rowan's name came up at morning briefing, and two sergeants went dead quiet. Another officer muttered, "Isn't he the guy reviewing the Salem precinct last year?" Darrell heard someone say the word audit. That one stuck. It felt heavy. That afternoon, the captain called them in, not casually, not a swing-by kind of talk. Formal summons, full uniform, a folder already sitting on the desk when they arrived. Officers Keaton, Maddox. "This is in regard to the incident involving Dr. Rowan." Across from them sat two individuals in plain suits. No badges, just clipboards and calm eyes. "This isn't about that one stop," one of them said. "This is about the others. The pattern." Riley felt the air shift. Darrell stared at the folder, but didn't open it. The suit on the right said, "We'll need to begin pulling stop reports. Use of force records. Complaint history. Effective immediately." "Are we being accused?" Riley asked. "You're being reviewed," came the reply. "We'll let the patterns do the rest." That night, Darrell didn't sleep. He pulled up old reports, looked at numbers that once meant nothing, names he hadn't thought about in years. But they were looking now, and the man with the orchid lapel pin wasn't just someone they cuffed. He was the one person in the state with the power and the will to pull the whole file open. Quietly, carefully, thoroughly, and he'd already started. Courtroom 3B in Eugene's Municipal Hall wasn't built to feel grand, just gray. Gray chairs, gray carpet, gray silence. But that morning, everything inside it felt like it might crack open. Darrell Keaton sat 2 rows back, uniform stiff, badge-polished jaw clenched. Riley Maddox was beside him, hair pulled tight, boots perfect. Neither spoke. They hadn't spoken much at all since the call came in 2 days ago. "You're testifying in a procedural review regarding a detainment incident on Fifth Avenue," the email had said. No further details. No explanation. Darrell had assumed Dr. Ellis Rowan would be in a jumpsuit sitting across the aisle with a defense attorney, whispering strategy into his ear. But when the bailiff called them forward and opened the door to courtroom 3B, the world tipped slightly. Ellis wasn't seated across from the judge. He was seated next to her, a tailored charcoal suit, that same orchid-shaped lapel pin, calm, unshaken, with a binder open in front of him. "What the hell?" Darrell muttered, his voice barely audible. Riley blinked, the words catching in her throat. A few rows back, local press scribbled into notepads. Someone from city council leaned over to whisper to a colleague, and then the judge spoke. "Today's hearing is a preliminary review of field procedure and detainment protocol involving Dr. Ellis Rowan. Dr. Rowan will be serving in an advisory capacity as Deputy Director of Civil Oversight for the state of Oregon." It hit like a bat to the ribs. Darrell's face didn't move, but his shoulders locked into a square of tension. Riley stared straight ahead. Still, hard. The judge continued. "Officers Keaton and Maddox, please approach." They stood, not with the confidence of past courtroom appearances, but with the awareness that something had shifted and they weren't holding the reins anymore. "Walk us through the reasoning behind the detainment," the judge said. Darrell cleared his throat. "We received a call. Male suspect, black dark blazer, suspicious activity near a vehicle. We saw a man matching the general description and standing alone." Standing outside a cafe with a croissant bag, Ellis added quietly, not looking up from his binder. "Sir," the judge nodded toward him. "You may speak after the officers conclude their account." "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, voice steady. Darrell continued. "He didn't provide ID when asked. I was never given the chance," Ellis said again, slightly louder. The judge raised a hand. "Dr. Rowan, please wait." Riley stepped in now. We had reason to believe the scene was in progress. The suspect didn't comply with commands. We followed protocol for a potential theft in progress. Then the judge turned to the front bench. Dr. Rowan, your statement, please. Ellis clicked his pen once. Not hurried, not dramatic, just once. Then he looked up. I've reviewed hundreds of cases just like mine. Vague calls, thin descriptions, hasty assumptions. And what I've learned over time is that these aren't isolated mistakes. They're patterns, the kind that stack into real consequences for real people. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. You didn't ask my name. You didn't ask for my ID. You went straight to force. You assumed what I was before you asked who I was. The courtroom held its breath. I wasn't detained, Ellis said. I was profiled. And now, as part of the Civil Oversight Office, I am formally requesting a departmental procedural review. The judge nodded. Motion granted. Daryl's stomach turned. Not just because of the words, but because of the silence that followed. The kind of silence that doesn't end with applause, just reckoning. Over the next week, the review began. Each morning brought a new folder, new data, body cam logs, incident reports, complaint files long buried in desk drawers. The courtroom transformed into a stage for exposure, not for Ellis, but for the system. Day 2, Ellis presented a map, red pins dotted across neighborhoods. These represent stops made by officers Keaton and Maddox over the past 5 years, he explained. Note the clustering same areas, same demographics, same language in the reports. He flipped a page. Suspicious behavior, matched description, non-compliant tone, words repeated like mantras. One witness took the stand, Julian Marks. Middle-aged, soft-spoken, still wearing a wrist brace. I asked for a supervisor when Officer Keaton stopped me, he said. He shoved me into my own car hood. Were you charged? Ellis asked. No, sir. Were you ever contacted again by the department? No, sir. I filed a complaint, but nothing happened. Another witness, Maria Sanders. Her teenage son Isaiah had been walking home with a grocery bag when he was thrown to the pavement. They thought the bag was a weapon, she said. He was bringing me tulips for Mother's Day. She paused. He hasn't spoken much since. Riley flinched at that one. She remembered the incident vaguely, but at the time it hadn't seemed out of the ordinary. Daryl leaned forward during one testimony, his knuckles white. He wanted to speak, to explain. But explain what? That it was routine, that they'd been trained to trust instinct over inquiry. Ellis never raised his voice. He didn't need to. His calm pulled the walls tighter around them. The badge, he said during one cross-review, doesn't entitle you to skip steps. It obligates you to take more of them. He slid another page forward. Here's a report with no body cam footage. Another labeled corrupted. A third never uploaded. Tech error, Daryl muttered under his breath. But even he didn't sound convinced. That might be believable once Ellis said maybe twice, but not 4 times. Not when every one of those stops followed the same pattern. The judge said nothing. The panel members, some civilian, some legal observers, wrote notes in silence. Ellis leaned back. This isn't about criminality, it's about comfort. The comfort of predictability, of knowing you won't be questioned, of acting without pause. Riley finally spoke. You're making it sound like we were targeting people. You were targeting assumptions, Ellis replied. And those assumptions just happened to wear the same faces again and again. For the first time, Daryl didn't look angry. He looked tired. The review continued. More data, more names. Some officers from other departments testified about patterns they'd seen, the ones who chose to see. It's not about bad apples, one observer said. It's about bad habits. By the 5th day, the room had changed. Even Riley noticed it. Conversations before the hearings were shorter. Eye contact was less frequent. The weight of scrutiny had settled like dust. On the final morning of the review, Ellis stood before the board. No lawyer, no theatrics, just the orchid still pinned to his lapel. I've said what needed to be said, he began. You've heard the data, you've seen the files, you've listened to the stories. Some of them painful, all of them real. He looked toward Daryl and Riley. I don't believe you joined the force to harm, but somewhere along the way you stopped seeing people. You started seeing profiles. Neither officer spoke. This isn't revenge, Ellis said. It's accountability. He turned to the board. My recommendation is removal from field duty for both officers. Indefinite. Pending retraining, psychological evaluation, and full departmental audit. He paused. And that the flagged cases be reopened for review. The board took 2 hours, then returned. Officers Daryl Keaton and Riley Maddox, the chairperson, said, "You are hereby suspended from field duty effective immediately." There were no objections, no shouting, just silence. The same silence that had followed every stop, every assumption, every missed chance to ask a simple question. Ellis gathered his binder, walked toward the exit. As he passed, Daryl whispered, barely audible, "I didn't think it would end like this." Ellis paused, then replied, "It didn't have to." And then he was gone. Just like that, the man they cuffed outside a cafe, the man with the orchid, the man they should have seen before it was too late. The sterile hearing room off Jefferson Avenue didn't echo like a courtroom, but the silence inside it carried more weight than any gavel ever could. It picked up right where the courtroom had left off after the board recessed to deliberate Ellis Rowan's recommendation after the doors had quietly closed behind Daryl Keaton and Riley Maddox, who hadn't said a word as they left the courtroom. That day their badges still clipped on, but somehow feeling heavier. The potted orchids on the far windowsill looked recently watered, and someone had adjusted the air vents, so the chill in the room settled low in the chairs. Daryl adjusted his collar twice, but didn't loosen his tie. Riley sat perfectly still, her folder unopened on the table in front of her, fingers laced. Neither had slept well in days, since Ellis had walked into courtroom 3B, not as a defendant, but as deputy director of civil oversight. The ground under them hadn't stopped shifting. The man they'd cuffed outside a cafe with a croissant bag and a calm tone had dismantled their entire sense of normal, using nothing but data, patience, and the truth they'd stopped recognizing. When the panel re-entered, there were no theatrics, no dramatics, just the creak of chairs and the sound of shuffled papers. This hearing, the lead panelist said, concludes a formal review under the authority of Article 12 of the State Law Enforcement Accountability Act. Her voice didn't shake. Based on evidence presented, testimony reviewed, and established patterns identified through departmental records, the board has reached a decision. Daryl stared straight ahead. Riley swallowed once, then again. Effective immediately, the panelist continued. Officers Keaton and Maddox are removed from field duty. Status suspended pending completion of corrective training and psychological assessment. The department will undergo a full procedural audit within the next 90 days. The air didn't change, but something in their chest did. Not a crash, not a fall, just a quiet internal cracking. The board stood. The session ended. There were no objections, no appeals, just silence in the knowledge that they were no longer shielded by the uniform they once believed would always protect them. Ellis didn't speak again. He closed his folder, stood, nodded once to the panel, and made his way toward the exit. He passed them like they weren't obstacles, just part of a story he'd already finished writing. Daryl looked up. "Did you want this to happen?" he asked, not confrontational, just searching. Ellis stopped but didn't turn around. "I wanted it not to keep happening," he said, then walked out. No badge, no escort. Just that orchid pinned to his lapel and the quiet certainty of a man who knew exactly what the system looked like from the inside. The days that followed felt strange. The precinct wasn't loud with gossip, but it wasn't quiet either. Conversations stopped when Daryl entered the break room. Eyes shifted when Riley passed the front desk. Nobody said it out loud, but the shield around them was gone. The unspoken protection, the benefit of the doubt, the insulation of silence. Daryl cleared out his locker that Friday, a few pens, a mug from his daughter that said "World's Okayest Cop," a spare vest he hadn't worn in 2 years. No one offered to help. He started work the following Monday at the city's Department of Vehicle Enforcement, monitoring traffic camera logs for violations and plate discrepancies. No sirens, no field work. Just a small cubicle with a double monitor and a laminated instruction sheet on how to file a daily report. Riley took personal leave. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. The last anyone heard, she'd moved back to Idaho to be closer to her sister. Deactivated her department email. Declined all interview requests. She didn't fight the board's findings, but she didn't accept them out loud either. She just disappeared quietly the way Ellis had walked away from the courtroom. And while the press didn't hound the story, There were no viral clips or protest marches that week. Things began to change underneath the surface. A new poster appeared in the precinct hallway civil accountability hotline. All reports confidential. Rookie officers lingered a little longer in front of it, reading the small print. A few whispered about the orchids that had started appearing in the break room, quietly placed by someone no one ever saw, one of them tucked into the edge of a case file cabinet with no note. The training manual was revised. Slightly. Not sweeping change, but targeted. Officers now had to review actual body cam footage from real interactions, not dramatized examples. One module featured the Rowan detainment. No narration, just the footage, the hesitation, the cuffs, the silence. A new question was added to the recruit intake forms. Describe a mistake you've made and how you responded to it. It wasn't about shame. It was about whether someone could carry a badge and still admit they'd been wrong. Some victims were contacted, not all, but a few. Julian Marks received a letter from the mayor's office, hand-signed. Maria Sanders got a follow-up call from the city attorney asking if she'd be open to mediation. No headlines, no settlements splashed across local news. Just quiet signs that someone had noticed. Someone had listened. Ellis didn't stay in Eugene. That was never the plan. His role required movement, city to city, case to case, pulling threads others wanted to leave alone. The Monday after the hearing, he was seen at the Eugene Amtrak station, boarding a train north, still in a dark suit, still wearing that orchid pin. No fanfare, no cameras, just a man with a folder full of names and a mind wired to track patterns where others saw coincidence. In the months that followed, word spread, not of Ellis himself, but of the review process. Other departments asked quiet questions. Other names surfaced. Because when someone finally watches the watchers, the system can no longer pretend it polices itself. Ellis Rowan wasn't chasing revenge. He was chasing structure, integrity, the long game. And though Daryl never said it out loud, something inside him had shifted. He started watching his own body language in the grocery store, paid attention to how often he made assumptions in silence. He never wore the badge again, never asked for it back. Riley never spoke publicly about what happened, but her younger sister later said that she started attending community mediation panels. Listening, not talking, just showing up. In the department, they didn't collapse. They adjusted, they bent, they re-examined. Because justice doesn't always wear a uniform or bang a gavel. Sometimes it wears a lapel pin shaped like an orchid and moves like a shadow with a clipboard. The people who once believed they were untouchable had been touched. And though the world outside didn't erupt, something in that city softened, cracked just enough for new light to come in. Because justice didn't shout. It walked, patient, relentless, measured, and this time it was taking notes. In a world where assumptions move faster than facts and authority often speaks louder than truth, the story of Dr. Ellis Rowan reminds us of a powerful truth. Accountability begins with awareness. Too often we move through life believing we see clearly, trusting our training, our instincts, our experiences. But sometimes what we see isn't reality. It's a pattern we've grown used to. And patterns, if left unchallenged, can become blind spots. This story wasn't about heroes and villains. It was about human beings, some wearing badges, some wearing suits, each faced with a moment that demanded reflection instead of reaction. Officers Keaton and Maddox didn't wake up that morning looking to do harm, but intent doesn't erase impact. They operated within a system that rewarded speed over scrutiny, reaction over reflection. And in doing so, they cuffed a man who had spent his life building the very safeguards that were supposed to protect people like him. Dr. Rowan's response wasn't vengeance. It was calm, methodical truth-telling. His greatest weapon wasn't a courtroom outburst. It was his ability to let the facts speak louder than his feelings. That's a lesson for all of us. In a culture that often rewards noise, outrage, and escalation, there is quiet power in staying composed, prepared, and focused on justice, not personal satisfaction. To our viewers, let this story be a mirror. Ask yourself, when have you acted too quickly? When have you judged someone without knowing the whole picture? And more importantly, what will you do next time you're in that position? Justice doesn't always look like a headline or a courtroom victory. Sometimes it looks like a revised training manual, a letter of apology, a long overdue conversation. Sometimes justice looks like someone in a dark suit with an orchid on their lapel, walking quietly out of a room having just made sure the system remembers the names it once tried to forget. Thank you for watching and listening to U.S. Instructive Stories. If this story moved you, made you think, or challenged your perspective, we invite you to subscribe to the channel. Every story we share is a step toward deeper understanding, more accountability, and a more compassionate America. Let's not look away when it matters most. Until next time, stay aware, stay thoughtful, and stay willing to grow.